Hey, how's it going? Hope you're well. My name is Malcolm, and today I'll be the chef as we cook up some amazing Blender geometry nodes recipes that are some old favorites of mine. I picked ones that you won't have to look hard to find a use for, and for each of today's 4 recipes, I'll break down the nodes, explain how they work, and then give some examples of how I've used them with my own projects, and I'll also leave you with some ideas on where you could apply it for yourself. No matter what your experience level is, I hope you'll find them interesting and useful for your next or first Blender project. Without further ado, let's take a look at our first recipe. So we'll go ahead and start with a simple node group that will let us distort geometry in some interesting ways, and it has a lot of flexibility for adjusting. We only need 5 nodes too, so it's pretty easy to set up. And here's what we'll need. Some sort of mesh. In this case, we'll use a grid, a noise texture, combine XYZ, set position, and optionally we can add a set shade smooth node. So each point in a mesh has a position that we can move individually with the set position node. Using a noise texture, we can move each point differently, and because of how flexible the noise texture node is, it's super easy to adjust it until we get something that we're happy with. The Combine XYZ node allows us to isolate this movement to 1 or 2 axes if we want as well. And for our project, we'll only move our points on the Z axis. The Shade Smooth node does exactly what the name suggests and changes our faces to be smooth instead of sharp, which depending on what we're going for, we can remove if we want. For our setup, since we're using a grid, it's making this nice terrain, which we can make flatter or rougher with the noise texture. And the cool thing here is that we can change it to 4D, and then we use this W value to shuffle the noise. And we could even animate the value, which would make it move like waves, which is pretty cool. We're also not limited to just grids. We can plug in any geometry and get some interesting results with those as well. For my own projects, I've used this setup to make the terrain in my city generator, and my Minecraft world generator uses a similar concept. It's just adjusted a little bit to work with blocks. This recipe is useful for adding procedural detail with a lot of flexibility. So you could use it for things like quickly generating a lot of variations of something, like rocks or trees. You could add detail to an object, like wrinkling paper, or you could use it to make some interesting dynamic animations. So let's move on to our next recipe, which I call Scale Along Normals, and it's another simple setup that gives some fun and pretty cool results because it lets us move faces out from the mesh with this cool like explosion-y effect. And here are the nodes that we'll use. So we'll need some sort of mesh, split edges node, set position, a vector math node set to scale, and the normal. This setup works with face normals on the geometry that we plug in, and every face has a normal, which is a vector that points in the same direction as the face itself, and we can use vector math to scale along that vector, and then use the set position node to adjust the original position of each individual face so that it moves out along its own normal. So usually faces in a mesh will share the same edge, which gets in the way of the effect that we're looking for, but we can duplicate shared edges and then give them to each face so that they become disconnected with the split edges node. With some more nodes, you could isolate the parts of the mesh that you want so that the whole thing isn't moving all together at the same time. You could do this based on a lot of things like the index, proximity, or the position. I've used this node recipe to give some flair to my Endless Engines animation, which is combined with a proximity setup so that as you move this sphere around, it moves the faces that are close. And I really like how it looks. It gives a very interesting effect, and really it's not that complicated, which is pretty cool. This setup is great for making these kind of animations, and you could use it for things like exploding an object. You could show the inside of an object, or you could even go the opposite direction and make a black hole. And for bonus points, you could even combine this with the mesh distortion recipe to get some even more interesting results. Our third recipe lets us animate objects and control movement from within geometry nodes. Out of all the recipes in this video, this one is definitely the one that I've used the most. Our sample curve recipe will need these nodes. We'll need some sort of curve. We could either make this with geometry nodes or use a curve from the scene. a sample curve node, some sort of mesh to put on the curve. In this case, we'll use a cube, align to vector, transform geometry, and set position. The sample curve node is at the core of this setup, and it lets you pull information from a specific part of a curve. You can pick where on that curve the information is evaluated by using the factor input. So for this recipe, we'll take the position of the point on the curve and put a mesh there using the set position node, which we've seen a lot of so far in this video. We can also align that mesh to face the curve by grabbing the curve tangent, which is another vector that describes the direction that the curve is pointed. The align to vector node allows us to rotate a mesh to point the same direction as a vector, and we just plug that rotation into a transform geometry node. I do a deeper dive into the align to vector node in my latest episode of Blendworks, so if you're curious, definitely go check that out. I'll leave the link in the description. Now, this is definitely one of my favorite recipes of all time because it allows you to have dynamic animations from within nodes. Examples from my own projects include my fishing game, where the pole moves by sampling the curve, so that as you're using the cast and reel input, it's animating it. When I remade Wii Sports in Blender, most of the animations were done this way as well. And in my engine generator, the timing chain is a curve with a bunch of chain link instances on it. And just one more example, the orbits in my galaxy generator project work this way. And the cool thing there is there's a bunch of extra stuff on that project that's controlling the factor input speed based on how elliptical the orbit is and the current position of the planet. This recipe is a great start for a ton of projects. You can find really any movement with a series of curves. Some examples include vehicles traveling, so like trains, airplanes, cars, things like that. Components like levers, gears, and switches. And you could also use it for things like animated text effects. As an extra bonus for this recipe, you can use math nodes like modulus, sine, or ping pong on the factor input, and it gives even more effects on the animation. So for example, modulus here is allowing this plane to loop on this curve infinitely. So once it reaches the end, it just starts over again. And here we can see the ping pong creating this bounce back and forth. There are a ton of other things you can do with the math functions, so definitely just try them out and see what happens. So we've reached our last recipe, which lets us put random objects on any set of points, and we can choose how likely certain objects are to appear. This setup has a few more nodes than our other recipes so far. We'll need at least 2 meshes, but we could plug in as many as we want. A random value node, domain size, geometry to instance. We'll also need some points. Grids are a flexible way to add points, so that's what we'll use in this case. A math node set to multiply, float curve, and instance on points. This whole recipe hinges on the instance on points node, and just like you might imagine from the name, this node puts instances on points. So first, let's add some points. We can just use a mesh in this case, since the node will pick the points of that mesh. And next, we'll need some instances, which for our purposes with this recipe, we can just think of the same as geometry. We can combine different geometry into one input, but keep them as separate instances with the geometry to instance node that plugs into our instance on points. Make sure to check pick instance so that the node differentiates between instances instead of adding the whole collection. The other half of this setup is picking an instance with an index. So let's say we have a collection of 2 meshes. Both of those meshes have an index, which is basically like an address, so each mesh has its own individual index. Specifically, an index is an integer that starts from 0 and goes up by 1 for each additional mesh in a collection. The order that the meshes are in does matter because that will affect the index. So if we have a cube and a sphere in that order, the cube will get the index 0 and the sphere will have an index of 1. We can then use that index to pick whatever mesh we want. Using the random number node, we'll generate a random number for each point, but we'll need to make sure that the number being chosen is within our index range. In our example, we only have 2 meshes that we're inputting, so our number will need to either be 0 or 1. We can use a float as an input since it automatically gets rounded to an integer when it's plugged into the green input on the instance on points node. The domain size can automatically count how many instances that we have in our collection, and then we can multiply our generated number to be within the correct range. Right now, all the instances in our collection have the same chance of being chosen, which we might want, but I think it's a lot more interesting if we have some more rare objects and some more common objects. As a finishing touch, we can adjust the probability of certain numbers being selected with the float curve node to get a feel for how it changes the probability of certain objects. I've used this node setup in my Minecraft world generator in a couple places, but one of the examples is anytime there's stone, there's a chance for a ore to be generated instead. The fish in my fishing game are also chosen with a similar node group, and other examples include the planets in Galaxy Generator and the buildings in my city generator. This recipe makes it super easy to add detail to environments quickly. For example, you could add objects to terrain with a distributes point node, so you could scatter rocks, trees, grass, whatever you want. Or you could do something like this crowd simulator that I made, where it uses the instance on points to put a bunch of different people there, and then they all have their own walking directions, walking speeds, and there's a bunch of different people to choose from. So there are some of my favorite simple recipes. One of the cool things about geometry nodes is that you can stack these recipes together. Just a few quick examples. In my city generator, the terrain is built with the mesh distortion recipe, and then the detail is added with the instance on points. So it adds like the buildings and trees and stuff on top of the terrain. Or in my Galaxy Generator project, the planets are all chosen with a chance of instance node setup, and then their motion is controlled with the sample curve node group. And here's a quick demo project that uses a piece from every recipe. So here the flowers are placed on the mesh with an instance on points, and then the probability of each flower is different. Each instance takes the closest face normal, and then it orients to point the same way as that face. And to add more detail and variation, the flowers are then distorted a bit to give it a more organic look. So I hope you find these useful. Your imagination really is the limit here, and we've barely scratched the surface on all the possibilities that there are. There's a lot more to explore with geometry nodes, so if you have any groups that you'd like to see me cover in the future, please let me know. Also, if you have any questions on a specific thing that I kind of glossed over quickly, let me know in the comments, and I'll do my best to help break down what's going on. I know this was kind of a quick overview. I'll put the node groups for those recipes up on Patreon, which is a great way to support the channel. Anyways, I appreciate you watching my video, and I will see you in the next one.